the Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
So recently I watched the 1960 presidential debate between JFK and Richard Nixon, and I used MapClaims to analyze it. This is my first time using MapClaims to analyze somebody else's debate, but I think it was an interesting experiment, and I hope to do it more in the future. So let's take a look at the resulting map. So mapping other people's debates is one of the reasons I've implemented the concept of puppets in MapClaims. We have a Nixon puppet and a Kennedy puppet in this debate, and you can tell by the little sock icons. And they're both controlled by my user account. This way, I can manage multiple characters in a public discussion without having multiple accounts. If you've ever arrived late to an argument that's been going on a while, you know it can take a while to catch up to what exactly is being argued and why. So I could go through every statement that I mapped, but one of the things I want to accomplish with MapClaims is making it easy to jump into a conversation and get a quick, high-level understanding of what the major points of contention are and where the argument left off. So let's go ahead and jump right in and take a look at the high level. At the top of the map here, we can see that I've divided the debate into 13 individual points that were made, some of which received more back and forth than others. I've added a few more features since I mapped the debate, so let's look at the sidebar here. We can see that the candidates disagree on 14 claims, and on the implication of 13 different arguments. There are also 13 claims and one implication on which they agree. We also have information about how many arguments each person still needs to address. MapClaims doesn't require you to respond to every single point a person makes, but you do need to at least clarify what part of an argument you disagree with. These arguments that they need to address are arguments where it's not really clear what they disagree with, and this means they probably need to clarify that for this line of debate to move forward productively, so let's start with these. We'll switch the currently selected person to Nixon so we can see the interface from his point of view. We'll click the link here to take us to this point. The root claim here by Kennedy is that America has been standing still.
I should make it very clear that I do not think we're doing enough, that I am not satisfied as an American with the progress that we are making. The question now is, can freedom be maintained under the most severe attack it has ever known? I think it can be. And I think in the final analysis, it depends upon what we do here. I think it's time America started moving again.
Now, for context here, Nixon is a Republican and the current VP to Eisenhower. The previous president was Truman, a Democrat.
Well, we have a comparison that we can make. We have the record of the Truman administration of 7.5 years and the 7.5 years of the Eisenhower administration.
In response to the claim that America has been standing still, Nixon says no way. The Eisenhower administration saw significantly more growth and movement forward than the Truman administration. As an aside, if we scroll through the arguments here, we can see that Nixon put great effort into arguing in favor of this claim, citing statistics about schools, hospitals, hydroelectric power, etc. But none of that matters, because Kennedy did not disagree with this claim. He disagreed with the implication. That is to say, he did not deny that the Eisenhower administration saw more growth, but rather with the implication of that statement. He says that while this claim is true, this fact does not support its conclusion, which is that America is not standing still. And he argues that this does not necessarily follow because the comparison is unfair, supporting that claim by pointing out economic difficulties under the Truman administration.
Difficulties that were facing the United States during that period of transition, 1946, when price controls were lifted. So it's rather difficult to use an overall figure of taking those 7.5 years and comparing them to the last 8 years. I prefer to take the overall percentage record.
In other words, big deal, Nixon. Beating the other guy while he's at a disadvantage sure looks like standing still to me. While he didn't explicitly say so, I think we can be generous and assume Nixon would disagree that this is an unfair comparison, otherwise he would not have made it. But it's not clear to me if he would disagree that there were economic difficulties, or if he would disagree that those difficulties make this an unfair comparison. This is why it's important to identify unaddressed arguments like this. It's not clear which part of this argument Kennedy might want to further support without first understanding which part Nixon actually disagrees with. Next up, we have a shorter one for Nixon. Kennedy says Nixon's plan for dealing with the agricultural surplus would not be effective, and supports by saying it's not enough of a departure from the current ineffective plan.
I think Mr. Benson's program has failed. And I must say, after reading the Vice President's speech before the farmers, as he read mine, I don't believe that it's very much different from Mr. Benson. I don't think it provides effective governmental controls.
So would Nixon counter by saying it is a big departure, or that it doesn't need to be a big departure? If he addressed this in the debate, I missed it. Next up, Kennedy says, a series of bills I supported were not passed, due largely to the threat of veto from the Republican U.S. president.
And we were informed at the time it came to a vote that if it was adopted, the President of the United States would veto it. In my judgment, a vigorous Democratic president, supported by a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, can win the support for these programs.
Nixon says the real reason they weren't passed is because they were too extreme.
The reason why these particular bills in these various fields that have been mentioned were not passed was not because the president was against them. It was because the people were against them. It was because they were too extreme.
Kennedy says no way. The education aid bill I proposed was less than what you proposed.
Secondly was the federal aid to education bill. It was a very, because of the defeat of teacher salaries, it was not a bill that met, in my opinion, the needs. The fact of the matter is, it was a bill that was less than you recommended, Mr. Nixon, this morning in your proposal. It was not an extreme bill.
So would Nixon say it's untrue that Kennedy's spending bill was less expensive, or would he argue that it was too extreme nonetheless? I don't know. Needs to be addressed. Now let's have a look at what points Kennedy left hanging.
And Mr. Nixon and Mr. Rockefeller, in their meeting, said a 5% economic growth would bring by 1962 $10 billion extra in tax revenue. Whatever is brought in, I think that we can finance essential programs within a balanced budget if business remains orderly.
Kennedy says the money to pay for the programs I advocate will come out of the increased tax revenues that result from the growth that will come from those programs. Nixon says you have to pay for those programs first. The growth comes later.
Whenever you appropriate money for one of these projects, you have to pay now and appropriate the money, and while they eventually do pay out, it doesn't mean that the government doesn't have to put out the money this year. And so I would say that in all of these proposals Senator Kennedy has made, they will result in one of two things. Either he has to raise taxes or he has to unbalance the budget.
It's not clear to me which part of this argument Kennedy would disagree with. Next up, we'll revisit a claim we saw earlier. Series of bills I supported, not passed due to veto threat. Nixon points out if the veto was the only problem, they would have been passed by Congress and then vetoed.
If the majority of the members of the Congress felt that these particular proposals were good issues, the majority of those who were Democrats, why didn't they pass them and send them to the president and get a veto and have an issue?
Now, I'm sure somebody with more poli-sci knowledge than me could talk about the threat of veto versus an actual veto and the way Congress behaves under those kinds of incentives, but whatever dialogue is to be had there, it did not occur in this debate, so I would call this another unaddressed argument for Kennedy. Now remember, an unaddressed argument is an argument that you have to address because it directly contradicts a stance that you hold, but we don't know which part of it you disagree with. That said, those are not our only leads for identifying interesting parts of the argument or possible points of contention. If we turn our attention to the arguments, we can also look at every point on which the candidates disagree for which no one has responded. Here, for example, Kennedy is defending some government regulations for agriculture because he doesn't think farmers can effectively balance the supply and demand of the market without government intervention.
The farmer plants in the spring and harvests in the fall. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They're not able to control their market very well. They bring their crops in or their livestock in, many of them about the same time. They have only a few purchasers that buy their milk or their hogs, few large companies in many cases, and therefore the farmer is not in a position to bargain very effectively in the marketplace.
Nixon disagrees with the implication, saying that government intervention only makes this worse and caused the current surplus.
The government has a responsibility to get the farmer out of the trouble he presently is in because the government got him into it. And that's the fundamental reason why we can't let the farmer go by himself at the present time. The farmer produced these surpluses because the government asked him to through legislation during the war.
I went ahead and assumed Kennedy would disagree with the claim, not the implication here, since the implication seems like a given to me, but he didn't explicitly counter-argue this. Now, in some argument mappers, we might follow a last word concept, basically meaning that if the other guy had the last word, you have to respond and make a counter-argument. And it might seem like Kennedy should respond because Nixon had the last word and Kennedy hasn't made any counter-argument here. But I have avoided that explicitly in MapClaims because it can be abused. If I just spout some kind of low-effort nonsense, then you have to respond, and it may take a lot of work or research to do that effectively. Instead, we do not require Kennedy to do anything here but to disagree, and from this point forward, it's anybody's move. They disagree about whether government intervention makes things worse. Fine. Nixon can argue in further support of this claim, which will create an unaddressed argument for Kennedy, or Kennedy could argue against this claim, which would create an unaddressed argument for Nixon. Next point, Nixon says local enterprise and activities like the building of schools have been able to flourish because of encouragement from the federal government.
The reason that we've had the funds, for example, locally, to build the schools and the hospitals and the highways, to make the progress that we have, is because this administration has encouraged individual enterprise. And it has resulted in the greatest expansion of the private sector of the economy that has ever been witnessed in an 8-year period.
Kennedy says no, that's not the reason. Schools have been built because communities were willing to raise property taxes so high.
The reason that the schools have been constructed is because the local school districts were willing to increase the property taxes to a tremendously high figure.
We know that Nixon disagrees that that's the reason because he's said as much. Once again, either person could expand on this by supporting or attacking this claim. Finally, we have a single node with no counterarguments. Nixon says Kennedy's government spending will cause inflation, and we have Kennedy disagreeing, but neither side really spoke further for or against this claim. Okay, that covers our disagreements on claims, so now we can take a look at our implications. Oh no, 8 of them that might need to be expanded on? I'm not actually going to go over all of these because these are not actually the most productive points to expand on. It is unfortunate but unsurprising that so many of these would be glowing in a political debate, and I want to talk briefly about why. When engaging in rhetoric, as politicians do, it's important for your words to sound good. It's so important that sometimes the meaning even takes a backseat to the words. In a MapClaims argument, the claims are what you actually said, and the implications are, in a sense, what you left unsaid. So if I make a statement like, people should eat healthier, you might want to disagree with me, and you might want to make a good, strong-sounding statement, something that no sane person would disagree with. So you might say something like, oh, it's important to enjoy life. And I say, sure, fine, of course, because of course I agree with that statement, and I disagree with the implication, but maybe I also want to make a good, strong-sounding argument that no sane person would disagree with. So I say, well, you can't enjoy life if you died due to neglecting your health. Now remember that an implication is the link between this claim and this one. So this box is like saying, if it's true that it's important to enjoy life, then it's not true that people should eat healthier. And now you agree with this claim, but you want to disagree with this box. So you're like, it's not true that the fact that you can't enjoy life if you're dead means that it's not true that if it's important to enjoy life, and you end up with this nightmare of parentheses and nested clauses that the human brain is really bad at processing. This, in my opinion, is part of the reason it's so easy for real-life arguments to deteriorate into shouting matches. We make statements like this, and we very quickly lose track of what the logical relationship is between what we're saying and what the original point was. You can avoid this by not leaving your implication to do all the work, and you do this by being as clear and as explicit as possible about what you mean when you make an argument. Put all of that work into the premises, not the implication. So for example, instead of saying it's important to enjoy life, you could say something like, eating healthier means sacrificing happiness for health, and people should not sacrifice any more happiness for health than they already do. This is a clearer argument, and it's better subdivided so that when somebody does disagree with it, we'll have a much better idea of what exactly they disagree with and a much more productive path forward. So remember, when arguing, if every word coming out of your mouth is obviously true, that can be very effective for rhetoric, but you're probably leaving all the complicated parts unsaid and actively harming the productivity of the conversation you're in. So, using that philosophy, let's take a look at least one of these implication disagreements in our Kennedy-Nixon debate. Kennedy says that last year, 1958, the U.S. had the lowest growth in GNP of any industrialized nation. This is a plain fact. Better to be clearer and more explicit here, maybe saying something like, if the United States had been as productive as it should have been last year, we would not have had the lowest growth in GNP of any industrialized nation. Nixon's response here is that last year was a recession year, presumably also a plain fact and unlikely to be disputed by Kennedy. This response could be clearer with additional premises like, it's not unreasonable for a country in a recession to have the lowest growth in GNP. Now, of course, I'm not saying that's what the candidate should have actually said. I'm discussing how to argue more clearly and productively, not how to win presidential debates. Last but not least, I want to go over my very favorite part of the debate, especially as it relates to MapClaims. Let's take a look at this particular back and forth.
The Soviet Union is making great gains. It isn't enough to compare what might have been done 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. I want to compare what we're doing with what our adversaries are doing, so that by the year 1970, the United States is ahead in education, in health, in buildings, in homes, in economic strength.
First of all, I think it is well to put in perspective where we really do stand with regard to the Soviet Union in this whole matter of growth. The Soviet Union has been moving faster than we have. But the reason for that is obvious. They start from a much lower base. Although they have been moving faster in growth than we have, we find, for example, today, that their total gross national product is only 44% of our total gross national product. That's the same percentage that it was 20 years ago. And as far as the absolute gap is concerned, we find that the United States is even further ahead than it was 20 years ago.
The point was made by Mr. Nixon that the Soviet production is only 44% of ours. I must say that 44% in that Soviet country is causing us a good deal of trouble tonight. I want to make sure that it stays in that relationship. I don't want to see the day when it's 60% of ours and 70 and 75 and 80 and 90% of ours.
Interesting. Did you catch it? I didn't even map Kennedy's last argument there because it doesn't belong in the chain, and that is because it's a trick. A very skilled rhetorical trick on Kennedy's part, and exactly the kind of trick I made MapClaims to help prevent. America standing still, says Kennedy, not growing at the rate of the Soviet Union. Nixon says they're starting from lower, we're still ahead in absolute terms. That all maps just fine, but then Kennedy says this.
The point was made by Mr. Nixon that the Soviet production is only 44% of ours. I must say that 44% in that Soviet country is causing us a good deal of trouble tonight. I want to make sure that it stays in that relationship. I don't want to see the day when it's 60% of ours and 70 and 75 and 80 and 90% of ours.
Where does that fit exactly? Does it contradict the fact that the Soviet Union started from a lower base? No. What about the implication? Well, we've got one of those horrible implication chains here, but let's try and reason through it. The reason Nixon brought up the United States being ahead of the Soviet Union in absolute terms was not to say that we shouldn't worry about the Soviet Union. In fact, Nixon denies this very explicitly. The reason he brought it up was to say that Kennedy's comparison was unfair, so an argument against this implication should be trying to show that Kennedy's comparison was fair after all. But in Kennedy's response, he has completely abandoned defending whether his comparison was even fair to begin with, and changed the topic to whether we are far enough ahead of the Soviet Union. In doing so, not only does he dodge having to defend his original imperiled argument, but he also makes it look like Nixon is saying we shouldn't worry about the Soviet Union, which is not at all what Nixon was saying. It's so slick. If I had been listening casually, I don't think I ever would have caught it, but because I was mapping the entire debate into valid syllogisms, I did. Lots more was said and mapped, and if you'd like to browse the argument map yourself, you can do so. It is live on map.claims, free for you to browse, and even add to if you'd like. The link is in the description. I've also put in a link to the original debate video that I watched for this. I recommend watching it. It's about an hour long, it's really interesting, it's a great window into history. So, did I capture and analyze this debate well? And how did MapClaims do as a tool for debate analysis? Leave a comment, let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.